All right, welcome to, I think this is lecture number 6 on the Kuzari. We are about to begin the study of it's number 62 in Mama Rishon, in the first essay. So if you have the Karubkin version that I have in front of me, we were just talking about this before I started recording. That's this book. Then it would be on page 82. Right? Number 62. That's where we were up to. We read through 61 last time. And if you don't have any other version, then it would be Ma'amar Rishon, or the first essay, paragraph number 62. That's where you would follow along. And as I said before, I am reading the Hebrew from Michael Schwartz's Hebrew translation. That was a translation into modern Hebrew directly from the original Arabic. But I have the Karubkin English in front of me because I use it when I want to see an English translation, because it's the best that we have. So here we go. Until this point, we have this long conversation now, this engagement between the Kuzari, which refers to the king of the Khazars, and the Chaver, that is the rabbi, right, the Jewish scholar. And interestingly, the three other scholars that were consulted in the beginning that we studied together, the philosopher, the Christian, and the Muslim, are they kind of disappeared. We'll hear from them later here and there, but for the most part, they disappeared. And it's clearly obvious that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, the author, wanted to show how the rabbi engaged the Kuzari in conversation, in long conversation, and in a back and forth. And what the feeling that you get from this is that the rabbi, obviously, the Chaver, obviously offered the king something that the other people didn't offer, right? And what he offered more than anything else was conversation, right? What he offered was give and take. What he offered was a back and forth. The others offered, this is our beliefs. I believe the A, B, C, D, E, this is what it is. This is the bottom line of Christianity, the bottom line of Islam, and the philosopher, the bottom line of philosophy. The rabbi gave a story, a story about a people and a relationship. So he engaged the king in a back and forth, and that's how he trapped him. Because not trapped him, that's how he drew him in. I was going to say entrapped him, but that has a negative connotation. That's how he drew him in. He drew him into the conversation, which is a very, very different kind of approach. And it's familiar to those of us that are familiar with what's kind of stereotypical of Jews. It's like, people want the short answer. I want the quick TikTok video. Give me the 15-second version. But in Judaism, it's never that way. It's always a long story. There's an if and an and a but and a maybe and a sort of and a sometimes, and what about, and so on and so forth. So now that he's engaged him in this conversation, and he's told them, well, look around the world. And I'm just kind of bringing us up to where we're up to. It seems obvious from the world that that we all came from a source. Right now, remember, in other words, all human beings must have come from a one person or one group of people, because he shows there's so many things that are universal to humanity. And he brought examples, which we said historically, anthropologically, nowadays we know these examples might not be so great, but the idea is still important. And that is that he brought examples of everyone uses a 7-day week, everyone uses a base 10 number system, but nowadays you would say, an anthropologist would say, there's certain commonalities in human culture that we all share that gives rise to the idea that human beings all come from one place, right? And so remember that we can't expect to find the language and the ideas that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi uses to be exactly what somebody in 2025 would use. So I try to extract the idea behind the facts that he mentions, and convey that. And then there's this sense that there's this relationship, this special relationship, this special tradition that we have that goes back generations and generations and generations, that we have this back and forth with God that he does for us, we do for him, and that makes us special. So now that he said that, I'm about to start reading 62. Amar HaKuzari. So the Kuzari said, Nania, okay, and the last thing that he just said was, well, what about those the people in India who believe that the world is thousands of years older and they have books that they claim were written thousands of years before, and so on and so forth. And the Kuzar and the Chaver's answer, the rabbi's answer, was what we would today consider to be racist. But remember, we can't. It's anachronistic to assume that they had the same. He didn't know anyone from India. He assumed they're backward people, they're uneducated people, and they have all kinds of ideas. And he did mention also they're dark people. So we see the prejudice against dark people has a very long history. It wasn't born in antebellum America. It came back. So the Kuzaris, the king says to him, Nanya, okay, so my argument about those people out there in India that have beliefs that are counter to yours, Naniach sheti'unai klapecha, that my argument against you, hayu legabe anashim pshutim shchorim, that argument came from people who are simple-minded and backwards. And in the translation directly from the Arabic, it says and black, right? Whereas in the Hebrew, in the English Korubkin, he doesn't translate that. There's probably a reason why he left that out. But anoshim she'ein lehem de'ah achida, they don't have a real unified and consistent philosophy. So your answer was good. So I can't bring you a proof against your idea from the people over in India. What about the philosophers, right? They're so good at logic and in discerning the truth, and they're so good at it. So clearly, if they have a different opinion, there must be something about it. There must be something worthwhile thinking about. All of them agree together that the world is eternal and there was no actual beginning. And it's not just 10,000 years or 20,000 years. Ella Ein Sof. It's an infinite. The world was always existed. Now, for those that were with us when we studied Rambam together, they would remember that the Rambam mentioned this many times, the Aristotelian view that the world was kadum, the world is eternal. I explained that, and this is something some people miss, and that is, while nowadays in modern science doesn't believe anymore that the world is eternal, right? If you talk to somebody, find a scientist, they'll tell you the universe started with the Big Bang, right? Now, obviously Aristotle had no idea or couldn't even possibly conceive of something called a Big Bang. But what Aristotle was saying when he said the world was eternal was he was saying as follows: the rules of science, the rules of physics and chemistry and biology, etc., are fixed rules, right? So whatever we see in front of us, what you and I see when we look out the window and we look around our room and we look at our hands or look in the mirror, are things that exist because the rules of science dictate that these things should be the way they are. So if those rules are unchanging, right, then the same thing that exists today should have existed yesterday and the day before and the day before and so on and so forth till bazillions, until forever, all infinity years ago, right? And that's why they concluded that the olam was kadam, the world was eternal. Bear that in mind when you think about that, because Aristotle's statement that the world is eternal is similar to a scientist today saying there is no creator, right? But the world exists because of rules of science, rules of physics that dictate that what is what would happen, because these are the rules. And if you put those rules into play, this is what will result, right? So the argument that Rabbi Yehuda Levi is going to try to make against the olam, the world being eternal, I think is very analogous to the same argument that someone would try to say today if they were trying to tell someone who claims today there is no creator, the world is based on rules, and the world exists because those are the rules of science. That's just the way physics works, and this is the world that we see. And bear that in mind when we do this. And remember, there was a third model at the time, and that it's called in the Jewish literature and the Rambam and in Yehuda Levi the Platonic model. Whether it's actually from Plato, I don't know Plato's philosophy enough, but I think it has origins in Plato. And the Platonic model is that there was a moment of creation, but God created the world out of some primordial substance. There was some kind of substance, and then the world came out of that substance. Of course, that begs the question, well, where did that substance come from? Who created that substance? But that's beyond the scope of tonight. So now that we have this, so let's go to item number 63. So I'm on page 83 now. So the rabbi goes ahead and answers, well, what about the philosophers? So he says, La philosophim tzarich limchol. For starters, he respectfully pushes aside the philosophers. He doesn't say, oh, they're a bunch of stupid idiots, so scientists don't know what they're talking about. That's not the approach that he takes, right? He says, no, we have to forgive them because they're missing something. They didn't receive any special wisdom by tradition, right? The Greek philosophers. Rather, and his historical understanding has, because they're Greeks, and they come from from the children of Yefes, who was one of the sons of Noach, Toshav Tzafon, the one who dwelled in the northern lands. But the wisdom, the knowledge of God that came down from Adam, that is the wisdom that teaches us about God, right? And a creator. That was passed down through Shem, through the Semites, right? That is the special inheritance, the special treasure which Noah gave to his son Shem. That knowledge of God as a creator. But that knowledge is something that existed forever, and will always exist. It came all the way from the first human being. However, but to the Greeks, how did they come upon the knowledge that they have? When they became a powerful nation and they were strong and they were the rulers of the world, so they had the time and the energy and the resources to sit down and start thinking and doing scientific, the then equivalent of modern scientific and philosophical research. So they had the opportunity. Everyone else in the world was poor and downtrodden and so on. So they didn't have the opportunity. The Greeks had the opportunity because they got the power when they took over from the Persians, and the Persians got the power when they took it from the Chaldeans, right? And the philosophim tzamchu biyaban b'meishel tonam. So they in Greece during the times when they were in charge, they had a special heyday, a moment in history that didn't exist prior, and after the Greeks lost power to Rome, right? They no longer had power. So the Romans took over. So the Greeks no longer have that wisdom. So in other words, they took this wisdom on their own. They figured it out without having a tradition, There's going to be more to say, so I don't want to comment too much, but I will comment that what Kuzari is developing here is that the criticism that he's building against the philosophers is a criticism of they figured it all out on their own without any guidance from tradition, whereas we have tradition plus we're able to think on our own. So think about that combination, and then you'll understand how Rabbi Yehuda Levi understands what makes our tradition unique. So the Kuzari immediately says, so therefore, mikan mischayev shein lahaman l'Aristotle b'chachmaso, just because they figured it out on their own means I shouldn't listen to Aristotle. Aristotle was intelligent, he was wise, and so if what he said is true, who cares if he had a tradition or not? Why does that matter? So Amar Chaver, so the Chaver, the rabbi answers, and he says, Achein. Then I'm in item number 65, which is now on page 84 in the thing. So he answers, yes, it's true. Achein, it's true. Hu heitil al sichlo machshavto mashu shelagabav loisalom masoros. It's true, right? That he, with his own mind, he thought and he used logic and logical deduction and contemplation to think about things which he had no tradition from someone reliable, that he should be able to learn and understand the opinions from someone who taught him. He figured it all out. So he started thinking about, how did this whole world come to be? How did the universe come to be? So so it was difficult for him when he was thinking about this, right? How do I understand the beginning of the world, the beginning of the universe? You think like, so just in the same way, it's very hard to describe this business of the world being eternal. The whole concept of to infinity is just a concept that our brains really can't. We can say it and we kind of know what it means, but we can't really imagine it, because everything we know of has some sort of beginning and some sort of end and some sort of cause, right? To think that things, they always were, it's the famous thing they say, turtles all the way down. It's just the way it always was, and it's very hard for us to comprehend such things. The concept of infinity doesn't really figure in our brains. So Aval, who had the Fesakeshav, but because he wasn't sure whether the world had an actual beginning moment or if the world was forever, he felt, because of his proofs, that he leaned in the direction of the world being eternal, asmach hashivasa bulbad, simply because of his thought process. He didn't think it would be appropriate to think about how many years, right, did this exist before me, right? But rather, but however, had there been a philosopher who had received a tradition of knowledge that was well known, and had given them proofs and ideas that you aren't easy to push away, then and he would have went in the direction of a world that was renewed, a world that came about in a moment of creation. Right? Because it's so difficult, in the same way that he thought that Kadmos, the idea of an eternal universe, was challenging, so too was the idea of a world that was created. So those were his words, but I want to just explain a little bit. So what he's saying here is that Aristotle was thinking. He didn't have anyone to teach him the right way, right? He didn't have anyone that had a tradition, right? So he's trying to think, well, did the world have a beginning, or was it always around? And he went through all kinds of proofs, right? And in his mind, they were all difficult. So he chose what he felt to be the less difficult path, which to him was the idea of Kadmos. This is not that much different from what Rambam said when he discussed this very same topic. Right? Remember, Rambam said that we can't prove either one of these ideas. Right? We can't prove Kadmus Olam, that the world was eternal, and we cannot prove, and he demonstrated this through logic, right? And we can't prove scientifically that the world was created either, right? This is really, really important. Think about that, because remember, those of us that learn the Rambam together, the Rambam says that we cannot prove that the world was created either. Let that sink in for a minute, right? Right. So therefore, because and then the Rambam presented, he said, it makes sense to say this way. It makes sense to say this way. It doesn't make sense to say this way. It doesn't make sense to say this way. We can argue back and forth forever. Therefore, we rely on our tradition and on what the Nevi'im and the prophets and the Torah teaches us, because it's possible, it makes sense, right? It is logically and scientifically and philosophically sound. Therefore, we're going to stick with what the Torah teaches us, right? And what the Kuzari here is saying is not that much different. He's saying that, but he's saying it from Aristotle's perspective. Aristotle had these two notions, and because he had no tradition, he therefore decided, I'm going to go ahead and assume that the world was eternal, because that's what makes more sense to me. Now, this is not that much different than a person having an argument today. And most of us have had these discussions at some point in our life, whether it was in our own head with ourselves, science versus religion discussion. Is there a creator or not? So a person goes ahead and argues, or you argue to yourself, well, the world is the way it is because all the laws of physics, you put all the laws of physics together, you get a world the way it is. And then, but then the counter, well, but how do I know there wasn't a creator. So what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi would say, and I know this is a stretch for me to say what he would say if he was alive today, but I'm going to do it anyway, right? He would say the same thing, right? And so would Rambam, right? You have a world, right, which exists, right? And it functions based on these rules, right? It functions based on the laws of science, right? Now, do those laws of science exist simply because they exist, or do they exist because a creator decided them to be that way, right? And that's not a question that you and I can prove, right? We can argue till our faces are green, blue, and yellow, but we can never prove why the laws are the way they are. Any scientist can tell you this is the following theorem, this is the mathematical equation that dictates this law of physics. But nobody can tell you why that's the law, right? Maybe it's the law because that's the way it has to be, but no scientist nowadays can at least tell you that why it has to be that way. It just is that way. They can tell you all kinds of things that happen as a result of that law, but why is the law that way? Why is this constant, this specific number? Nobody knows, right? So one can argue, well, that's just the way it has to be. And maybe that's true, in which case there is no creator. Or, right, just like Rabbi Levi is saying, or the Rambam was saying, maybe that's true. Or maybe it is that way because a creator decided to make it that way, right? Whoever created the universe, who you and I will call God, right, decided to make the laws that way. So now that we have that, let's go on to number 66. So then the Kuzari cuts in and says in item 66, right? If that's the case, that Aristotle felt that it's more logical to believe that the world is eternal, so then you have proof then. Aristotle believed the world is eternal because he logically deduced that it is so, right? So the Chaver answers right back. I got a little bit ahead of myself before. The Chaver answers what I was saying before, right? And that is, nobody can prove this, right? Nobody can prove whether or not the world is the way it is because God created it, or the world is the way it is because that's the way it is, right? Nobody can prove that question, right? The Torah will not tell us, right? The Torah cannot possibly be telling us to believe something which can be proven to be untrue, right? In other words, if the Torah tells us something, it can't possibly be that it's proven to be untrue. But rather, now this is where Rabbi Yehuda Levi differs from Rambam, right? How does God teach us, right? Teach us that the world is the way it is because God said so, and not because it's just randomly happens to be so? That's the role of miracles. That's why the Torah records miracles, which are hafaras minhag shalom, things that go counter to the laws of nature. Remember, Rambam felt very differently about this. Rambam felt that miracles are coded into nature, and miracles are not, and everything, runs counter to the laws of nature. But, again, that's Rambam. We're learning Rabbi Yehuda Levi now, right? So he felt that the miracles that are recorded in the Torah and in Tanakh are there to demonstrate to us that the reason why the world functions according to these laws of science is because God is the one who made them that way, and he demonstrates that to us with the miracles that are recorded. Through creating realities or changing one reality to another, in order to show us, right, to demonstrate to us that there is a creator to this world, and he can do what he wishes, as he wishes, when he wishes. The question of whether or not, right, philosophically, the question of whether or not the world is eternal, right, which I explained again, means that eternal world means that the laws of science are fixed simply because they are, or the chidush, or that the world came to be at a certain point, which would indicate a creator, is unclear. Harayas l'shnei shkulos. You can equally prove either way, right? In this, it's very similar. The similarity between Rambam and Rabbi Yehuda Levi here is striking. They both understood that when it comes to science, when it comes to philosophy, we cannot prove either way. I'm gonna go on a little aside for a second. I see a hand up, but let me just say this, and then I'll go to Jeffrey. Frequently, you'll hear conversations with people, and I hear this often in the Haredi world, where people will tell you that it's crazy to believe in science. It doesn't make any sense. Of course, there's a creator. Of course, there's God, and then they'll bring proofs to demonstrate as such, right? It's clear from the great thinkers of our past, both Rambam and Rabbi Yehuda Levi, between whom there were significant differences in philosophy and religious opinions. They both agree and understood that scientific inquiry is not going to prove God. Now, to think about that. In other words, we will not prove God by scientific inquiry. I think I said this story a long time ago, but one of my boys went with his senior class in high school a couple of years ago to Spain on a school trip. And they went to Cordoba, where they have, is it Cordoba or Sevilla? Whatever, the town where the Rambam is from.
Cordova, right?
Okay, Cordoba. Okay. So, and there's a statue of Maimonides, and the guy was saying everyone comes to kiss the statue because everyone thinks that they're gonna be wise if they kiss Maimonides' statue or something. Anyway, so he mentioned the tour guide, and he wouldn't necessarily expect more from a tour guide. He said a little bit about Maimonides. He wrote a great book, and when he summarized the book, he said in it the book describes philosophical proofs for God. Okay, now. It's fine. I don't have a beef with this guy because, I don't expect everybody in the world to know or understand. But it does reflect an incredibly huge misunderstanding of what Rambam and pretty much all the major Jewish philosophers believe in terms of the scientific proof for God. It's simply not true. And I remember going to yeshiva and learning this, right? That we're supposed to learn and understand, but through philosophy, that the Rishonim like Rambam believed that through philosophy we're supposed to come to an understanding of God. It's not at all true. In fact, it's the opposite, right? The Rambam and Rabbi Yehuda Levi all understood that science and philosophy will not lead to a proof of God's existence. However, they believed and understood that science and philosophy also does not and cannot and will not ever contradict the idea that there's a creator, right? And that's all they wanted to achieve with all of their philosophy, was to show us that the idea of a creator is viable scientifically and philosophically, and just as viable, maybe more viable, because they did present arguments why they think it's more viable, a better argument, but it was never proven that way. The bottom line in the end, according to both Rambam and Rabbi Yehuda Levi, and pretty much every other Jewish philosopher I've ever read, is the bottom line is that when we're struck with this dichotomy, it makes sense to believe in what the Torah teaches us, because it's like I said again, it's scientifically viable, philosophically viable, and we have this tradition, we have this Torah that teaches this to us. So let's take this right, because it makes sense, because it works. Anyway, Jeff, you still have your hand up, so go ahead.
Yeah, just a derivative question. I read this to say, well, look, we have miracles, and the existence of miracles proves God's existence. And my question is, and you've all seen it on history channels, the water, one of the examples in the footnote is, water turning to blood. They go and research and say, oh no, if you look into science, you can explain it. It was red mud,
right,
and it was this and that. And you've all seen where people have gone through and said these miracles are not miracles. They all have scientific explanations.
Yeah.
So if you go down that route, okay, so if the Torah doesn't have any miracles in it, how does that affect? If I were there, I'd say,
well, that would be a problem for Rabbi Yehuda Levi and Kuzari. Yeah. That would not be a problem for Maimonides, right? Because Rambam himself, in many occasions, tries to explain things that are written in the Torah as miracles in logical ways. The most famous being, whenever something happens that seems like over the top, he would explain it was just a dream, right? The Rambam explains the valley of the dry bones as just a dream for that very reason. He explains the Malachim visiting Avram Avinu, the three angels, as just a dream for that very reason. In numerous cases, he himself goes out of the way to explain miracles with a few small exceptions of Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus and things. Other than those small exceptions, the Rambam does the same thing. But for Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, that would be a challenge. How would he answer that challenge? He would say, no, they were miracles. The Torah says that he understood the Torah to be teaching miracles, and they were miracles, finished. And those miracles are here to demonstrate that God ultimately controls the world. He doesn't do them all the time, but anyway, Yosef, go ahead.
I was just going to answer the way that my rabbis answered when I asked that question, which is that whether they were or not natural phenomenons, the fact that Moses told the Pharaoh, "This is going to happen tomorrow," is a prophetic, vision that this is what's going to happen tomorrow, even if it is. They didn't have the Weather Channel back then, so if he said that the water will turn to blood, even if it's fungi or whatever they try to explain it was him saying it in the name of Hashem. He didn't know anything about changing water into blood any more than we do,
Right.
and therefore him saying it was just whether it was or wasn't a miracle. It was just the fact that he's told the Pharaoh, this is what's going to happen tomorrow. So
yeah, well, that's similar to what Rambam is. One of the options that Rambam gave us when he discussed miracles was that even if it's not a miracle, but the Navi had tapped into this vast spiritual divine knowledge and was able to know if and when and where what was going to happen, right? That was one of the Rambam's options for explaining the miracles, which is very similar to what you're saying. So that in and of itself is remarkable, having the wisdom to say that. But either way, yeah, but the point that you're bringing up is an important point for us to remember and discuss, and that is that that his approach to miracles is qualitatively different from Rambam's approach to miracles. He understands the miracles in the Torah as written, and they are miracles, and because they're miracles, those prove to us that we should follow the idea that there is a creator, and that it's not just is that way because it is that way. So but then he goes on. So why so there was the miracles, and then he says the even though the philosophical proofs for both of these paths are equal, but the chidush ma'adifa hamasoros me'adam rishon. However, the tradition that we have accepted from Adam to Noach to Moshe, olav shalom, that tradition leads us in the direction of accepting that there is a creator, because believing in prophecy and the prophets that taught us this is more true than just using our own logic, right? Right? Even if a religious person were to take a different view and understand that there's some kind of Homer Kadmon, some kind of primordial substance. This is the Platonic idea. This is the third option, right? Option 3, right? Which Rambam also mentioned, right? Some kind of concept that there were other worlds, and those other worlds were destroyed, and from the remnants of those other worlds, the next world was created, and so on and so forth. Of which we find references to such ideas throughout Chazal, hidden here and hidden there, thrown around, right? This wouldn't be a problem with that person's faith necessarily, right? In other words, he's openly saying that the idea in Yesh Me'ayin of creating something from nothing is not necessarily a foundation of faith that a Jew has to believe, otherwise he or she would be guilty of heresy, right? If you somehow want to go with that philosophical opinion, which is a third route, that it's not eternal and that it's not but it's also not new because it was created from something that existed beforehand, then fine, go ahead and think that, right? He doesn't say it, but the logical fallacy of that approach is the obvious one, because it doesn't really answer the question. Okay, so it's you still end up going ad infinitum. So once you're doing that, you might as well just assume the world has been this way all the whole time, right? So anyway, fine. So that's 6. So now we're up to 68. So we're turning the page in the Korobkin to page 86. Right? No, actually, we turned the page already. Okay, so but the Kuzari king now has a lot to sink his teeth into. So he's gonna give an answer. Okay, so Dayeni betchum ze betiunim hamishachneim ha'ela, right? Um, all of these ideas that you've been telling me are very convincing, right? I hear you. You're saying something very convincing. It makes a lot of sense. You have this old tradition. God made miracles to demonstrate that he's the ruler of the universe and the creator of the universe. And through these miracles, and this through a tradition that was handed down from father to son to student over generations and generations and generations. And you have this special relationship with God and so on and so forth. Okay, understood. Right? Right? However, if I'm going to continue our relationship here, so I'm going to ask you for stronger proofs. Let's leave this subject for a minute. And because he told him about miracles in the Torah. He threw out ideas, which are big subjects, right? But we'll get back to that, and you can tell me your proofs, right? And you'll say them. But I want to I want to go back to your main story here. Right? How is it that this great an idea, right? And this is the idea that he's going to go into now, the idea of prophecy, right? The whole idea is that how do we know this thing this piece of wisdom that's been passed down? We know it because that knowledge was passed from God to us through the process of prophecy. God spoke to the prophets, let's say chief among them, of course, Moshe Rabbeinu. And through Moshe, we learned all of this wisdom and knowledge. So how is it, right, that this Borei Hagufim, this creator of all beings, the ruchos and spirits and nefashos and souls, aschalim, and all of the minds and malachim and angels, hamiromam, which is so uplifted and lofty and makudash and holy, and it's above anything that we can understand or even imagine. This God, this creator being that you've described. So kol shekain hasagas hachushim, certainly it's something that our senses can't sense. We can't see it, we can't smell it, we can't feel it, we can't taste it, etc. So davak babriya hanivza, that this great being that we can't even imagine somehow attached himself or communicated in some way with this lowly creature, hamaguna b'chomer, which is just made out of nothing, just made out of chomer, just dirt and physicality. Even if it's true, right, that it's wonderful. Yes, a human being is this amazing creature, but still, in comparison to God, right? And it's true, even though it's true, yeah, even in the smallest creepy crawly little thing, right? This unfathomable wisdom. But the bottom line is that in comparison to God, it's nothing. So how is it that we communicate? How do we tap into this knowledge source that somehow it? Like, how does that work, right? How exactly does this communication work? And if you remember, Rambam gave a whole explanation based on Aristotelian physics, how it worked. But again, let's see Rabbi Levi and how he explains it. So Amar Chaver, so the Chaver says, because the bottom line is that all your stories about there being a creator and all that stuff, it's all well and good, right? And miracles, that's great, right? But it still doesn't make sense. Your whole religion, your whole relationship is based on a relationship. How is there a relationship? Right? How do you relate to this God? Right? How does that work? The corollary, the end of the argument that the Kuzari is making now. Okay, so there's a God, there's a creator up there, and he did his thing, and now we're down here doing our thing, right? How is there some connection, right? How is there a bond between you and him? So Amar al-Chaver says, so the Chaver answers, the rabbi answers as follows: Bidvarecha eila, right? And I'm starting number 69, so that's on page 87 right now, right? so he says, um, and a very fascinating answer here. So Amar Chaver, now I don't have to give you a long answer. Unfortunately, he will give him a long answer, but whatever, it's fine, right? This I can answer quick and easy. That's an easy one, right? Ha'im atami, and he answers typical Jewish answer with a question, right? Right? That wisdom that we find in this, you just admitted to me that even the smallest crawling creature is an incredible wise feat. Now, and that's what they knew that then. You can imagine now how incredibly complex this is. I just was listening to the radio the other day that they studied this common ant that lives all over Europe, and this ant, sometimes the colonies can get infected with a certain fungus, right? And they did this experiment. So they take a queen ant and of this species, and they drop her in a plaything, and she goes and lays her eggs, and they start making an ant colony, and they design it in a certain way, right? But then they took another ant of the same species, another queen ant, put it in the same kind of environment, right? And they put the fungus in there with it, this fungus that infects the ants. And they designed an entire anthill in a completely different way. And they did this over and over again. And they figured out that the anthill where the fungus was designed in such a way that certain compartments were protected from the fungus. Everything didn't communicate with everything else. Like, they designed it in such a way that if one place would get infected, it could be sealed off from the rest. So there was like pockets. There was a little area of tunnels and things here, little tunnels and things here. And the only way to go from A to B was to go up and out and back down, right? So it's just like, it's crazy that the amount of things that we learn. But the one that wasn't infected, they didn't care. They had tunnels going from everywhere to everywhere. It's like quarantine and COVID or something. That's that they figured out how to do. Anyway, Yosef, go ahead. I can't hear you.
I was just going to say that this sounds like the Borg in Star Trek, where they say that you will be your species will be overtaken and contributing to the greater good and everything, and resistance is futile. But it sounds like they can protect themselves from stuff like that. So it's real science fiction, even though it's. What you're saying is not fiction. So
the more we learn, it's just amazing. So you have this incredible creature, but the bottom line is that where then does it come from, right? This incredible wisdom that designs such an amazing creature. Lamashal, for example, Bervias Hanimola, and the creation of an ant, right? El Galgal, a Galgal is a sphere. Remember, in those days, they're all believing that the universe is made up of spheres that rotate around the geocentric universe, right? O al kochav, or the wisdom that makes up a star. O el mashu achar, any other thing, zulas abori, other than the creator himself. Bal hayecholas, who has the ability to do it. Hakoveas hamirus vashirim, he's the one who makes the laws of science, the measurements, the mathematical equations. How is it, where does this wisdom come that each creature has what they need, not more than what they need, not less than what they need? Where does this come from? Like, what do you call it? The wisdom that makes it all happen. Like, where is it? Where is it from? Right? So the Kuzari answers, that's nature. Nature does it, right? It's the same thing a person would say. That's the laws of nature. The laws of nature lead me to see all these interconnected things this way, and that's the way it works. And then you would apply, they would apply Aristotelian logic. We would explain it today in the terms of modern science, right? So Amar Chaver Mahu Ateva, what is nature? What does nature mean? What is nature? Right? Amar Kuzari, who koach min hakochos, it's some sort of a power. Al pima sheshamanu balimudim, according to that which we learned when we were taught in school, that the nature is such that such and such goes this way. We don't know what it is that drives all of this. What's making all of this? Why is it all the way it is? But certainly those that are wise, they know. The scientists must know. I was the kid. I became the king. I was too busy being busy with king affairs. So I learned about it in elementary school. But, the guys that went on to get PhDs, that they can tell you, go to them and they'll explain it. Right? So Amar Chaver, so the Chaver says, "Lo, it's not true." Right? Now I'm at item 73 now. Right? Um, um, don't go to the PhDs, right? They might be able to tell you 10,000 more facts about the ant and the bug and the stars and the moons and the spheres and so on. They can tell you all kinds of things that maybe you and I don't know, right? But their understanding of its nature, right, is just as I see that he translated as nebulous, so I'll use that as ours. It's just as nothing of that. They don't know really what it is, why it is, what makes it all work. Right? The philosopher, meaning Aristotle, right? He defined it a little bit, right? Right? He kind of limited it by saying that it is the ikaron v'asiba shebiglolo hadvarim ha'mitzuyim b'betnua. It's like remember we learned about the Aristotelian prime mover, right? That's what in other words, Aristotle said everything boils down to some form of prime mover. There's something, because everything has to end up, something has to be causing it all. So that's the usual term that we heard, right? Right? There is no all of these things. I'm sorry, I skipped some lines. Where I was reading, what was I reading? 73. I apologize. I jumped a little. Let me go back. So the philosopher Aristotle, he explained, right? There is the ultimate prime mover that because of it, the things that are within nature either move or don't move, or things that don't move start to move, right? Or the things that are moving decide to rest. It's not by chance. There is some prime mover that's pushing it all, that's making it all go, right? But in the end, that still begs a question. That still leaves a hole. So in other words, Aristotle might have touched on it a little bit, but the bottom line is that the philosophers, the scientists, they also don't know why it all is the way it is. And that's true, I would venture to say, to this day. Like, the greatest of scientists can tell you, right, that these are the laws that govern nature, right? And based on those laws, they can determine all kinds of really amazing things that explain all kinds of things that happen. And then there are mysteries, and presumably eventually someday they're going to figure out the laws that govern those mysteries, right? But why the laws are the way they are, who made the law, that law, that is not, or was there anyone that made the law that way? That's something that they don't know. Now, now in modern science, that people have been trying for years to find what they call the grand unified theory, right? It's the one law that governs all the laws. If there ever were to be found a grand unified theory, then that would explain why all the laws of nature are the way they are. But as of yet, scientists, and this is true, you can read modern scientific literature. I'm not just saying this. I do read this stuff, and the grand unified theory is getting farther and farther and farther away from reality. Right? It's not. We're not getting closer to it. We're getting farther from it. We keep discovering constants of nature. The more we go down one route, we find another constant, which leaves us in another dead end. Now, again, this does not prove God. Don't get me wrong. Don't go out and say, oh, 100%. Oh, you see, there's God, right? Because none of this will prove God. But what it will do is say, why is it that way? I don't know. Maybe it's that way because it's that way. Or maybe it's that way because someone or some being decided to make it that way so that we would have a world like the one that you and I live in. And that's all that Rambam, and that's all that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi needs to get us to the point where, right, where the creator is possible, and then we rely again on the Nevi'im, on the prophets. So I'm kind of up to here. We only have a few minutes left for questions. It's getting really cool. But I do again want to point out just one thing. One of the differences we've found so far here between Rambam and Yehuda Halevi is the idea of miracles, right? It's definitely a very different emphasis, right? And you find that difference reflected in conversations you may have with your friends as you walk through the Jewish world today, right? How people approach and understand the miracles in the Torah. You'll find the Maimonidean approach and Yehuda Halevi's approach still bouncing around in the Jewish world. And I just wanted to point that out. But we also see some very close similarities. But anyway, Bli Neder, next week we could start with item 74, the Kuzari's response to this. So we're in the middle of something. We're in the middle of his answer to that question, which is, how is it that God communicates with us? And Yehuda Halevi said he's going to give a short, quick answer, and he gave an answer that's so long that we're still in the middle of it. But that's fine. We'll pick up from where we left off. So tell me any questions, observations, problems, existential, whatever issues that you want to bring up. Fire away. Anything? Nobody? We're all just blown away. It's fine. No. All right. So Mr. Shem, next week, the same time, same. We'll continue. So we'll continue to learn. It should be fun.
Thank you, Saul.
All right. Have a
Thank you.
wonderful day. A wonderful evening. You all. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.